And it's true. If we can't keep self-control, someone will take control. And that's, of course, when you send in the troops, the National Guard, and so forth, because you have to maintain control. And that becomes a very dangerous step when that begins to happen. But where's our hope in that chaos? We go back to creation again, to Genesis 1. Earth was empty and formless. Darkness covered the deep waters. The Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. My picture here of creation at the beginning was like a dark, black and white, grayish picture, photo. Bland and bleak, colorless. But it says the Holy Spirit was hovering over all of that. And what happened eventually as you read the rest of Genesis 1? Life came. Color came. Beauty came. And it said, God said, goodness comes. He said he beheld his creation and it was good. What's our hope here? God is not absent from the chaos. God was not absent from the chaos of creation. He's not absent from the chaos in our own lives, whatever you may go through. He's not absent from the chaos in the world around us. He hovers over the chaos, trying to find ways to bring life and order and goodness in our personal lives as well as our nation. The issue for us is, how will the church be involved in bringing about that goodness? Number 3, hope comes by listening. Hope comes by listening. Proverbs 18 tells us to answer before listening, that is folly and shame. And I'll bet you've experienced that. I bet you wanted to share a concern or an idea you had or a thought you had, and the person you talk to, well, they just give an opinion or they give a quick fix, a duct tape kind of response to the problem without ever listening to what the issue is, whatever the question is. And the Bible says that's foolishness. That's foolishness. And you may have had that experience in your marriage where your partner just kind of, okay, kind of brushes you off or whatever, and pretty soon a person begins to feel, I don't matter. Perhaps you've seen children raised in homes, and in our own cases, where we've been busy raising our kids and life's going on and working, well, I'll talk to you later, I'll talk to you tomorrow, oh, just grow up, or you'll understand someday, and pretty soon kids begin to feel like, I don't matter. The difference is, kids are going to act it out. They will get your attention. They get our attention. And what I said earlier, what happens in our personal life and our family life, it begins getting expressed in the public life. Learning to listen. Learning to listen. Bonnie Christian writes for Christianity Today, which is a magazine that Billy Graham started over 50 years ago. And as a white woman, she gives a good point about what it means for us white people to listen to what's going on. She says, we have a self-deceiving pride. That is, we have the false confidence of believing we understand what we do not about a black person's view of law enforcement, or the justice system, or our nation's history, and so forth. It's not that we're mean or indifferent, it's just that we fool ourselves into thinking we understand that we know what it's like to be a black person in America. That we think we know how to fix their problems. And we have no clue to understand Al Roker. You know who Al Roker is, right? The nation's weatherman on Today's Show. When he says, when my children got to be driver's license age, I had to have the talk with them. And he wasn't talking about sex. He was talking about what do you do when a white police officer pulls you over the side of the road. Well, for most of us, we have a pretty simple response to that. Don't screw up. But you see, we haven't listened. We haven't listened. Listening brings hope because it brings understanding. And when there's understanding, there's more hope. There's hope in prayer. There's hope in prayer. The Reverend Senator Al Sharpton preached George's funeral sermon, and as he neared the end of his talk, he began to speak about hope. And he repeated a phrase that many of you have probably said in your life, maybe even during this season of life of the pandemic. Sharpton said, God is still on the throne. Or we might say God is still in control through the chaos. And that reminded me of another throne in Hebrews 4:16, that Jesus understands our weaknesses, and that we can come boldly to the throne of our gracious God, and there we will receive His mercy, and will find the grace to help us when we need it the most. And again, I'll bet in your personal journey of life, you've experienced that when you've been so desperate. You've gone to God's gracious throne, and He has blessed you with His mercy and His graciousness at the time you needed it the most. And what's true in our personal lives certainly is true today in our national life, to bring our nation to prayer before God. My wife, during George Floyd, shortly after he was killed, of course, the TV cameras were quick to get to Houston, Texas, in the ghetto area, in the inner city area where George was raised. And what we observed on television, there was a group of black people kneeling, and beside them a group of white people kneeling. And the cameras were close enough they could pick up some of the prayers, asking God's forgiveness for this situation in our nation's life, praying for each other's forgiveness for misunderstanding and abuses and so forth. Forgiveness of one another. Reconciliation. Reconciliation. What an image of healing. Prayer gives us hope because it reminds us of the one who is our hope and our help. Number 5, once we have prayed, once we have listened, it's time to take action. And I'm so grateful that I read your newsletter. There's a group of men here who want to do more than just wring their hands over the 6 o'clock news with the racial issues. For Ed Dole and maybe others that are part of the Kairos ministry to prisons, where most of the people they tell about Jesus are men of color. And I thought if I was a pastor nowadays and had a church, I would try to partner up with a black congregation or a Hispanic congregation to begin to build friendships and relationships, to listen. To listen. And if you want some ideas about that, I'll hang around afterwards and offer some other thoughts on that. But during this time, when I was in turmoil of all of this, I said, God, how can I get my white fat butt up and going and respond in some positive way to the chaos in our nation around this racial issue? And then I got another poke. And the Pope reminded me that back in February at the men's supper, and Dick might have been there and others from here, but we had a guest speaker that evening. He was a black man from Rock Island. During the day, by day, he works at Geneseo Communications. And by night and weekends, he's a preacher trying to start up a revival little church there in the Rock Island area, in a very needy area. The church is, they just gave it to him because it's such disrepair. And recently, by the storm, it got further damage, roof damage, and the insurance company won't cover it because it's an act of God, and they won't cover the repairs. But his name is Daniel Teague. And so I called Daniel and said, I'm Tony Hawks, yada yada. Could we get together for lunch someday? I'd like to visit with you. We set an appointment. We got together for lunch, and maybe we were together an hour and a half or so, and sharing and my getting to know him and his family and so forth. And when we got ready to leave, you know what Daniel said to me? Daniel said to me, Tony, I'm so glad you reached out to me. I thought, man, what do you mean? All I did was make a phone call and pay for lunch and listen. But for a black man to have a white man reach out for a relationship is huge. Is huge. The black community does not want the white church to do. We can't do it for them. But we need to partner up to do it with them. And he was blessed by that, and we've been in touch since then. And as we left, our waitress said, well, see you later. And then it dawned on me, a sidebar here, this young lady saw a white man and a black man bow their heads in prayer together. You got to wonder how God might use that in her life over this issue. Galatians says, let's not get tired of doing what is good. Let's not get tired of doing what is good. We can take action. And then, of course, there's our hope in Jesus. Our hope in Jesus. We go back to the footnote. Okay, go ahead to the next one. Number 6. Yeah, go ahead. That's fine, thank you. The footnote that we read earlier. Jesus said to them, you don't realize what your hearts are like. For the Son of Man has not come to destroy people's lives, but to save them. Our hope ultimately is in Jesus. In the early days of all of this turmoil, the newscasters would ask people, well, do you think there's hope that we can end racism in our lifetime? My answer to that question is no. We will not end racism. We can end injustice, however. And what do I mean? Justice is about righting wrongs. Justice is about setting bad things straight. Justice, as we found out, can end segregation in schools and so forth, and jobs and housings. Laws can change the way we behave, but laws cannot change the way people think or believe. The Supreme Court cannot erase the fear and hate that breeds racism. Laws cannot make us love. Only Jesus Christ can transform that kind of heart. What became of those 2 angry brothers that wanted to fry those Samaritan people? Well, in Acts 12, you can read where James was executed by the state. He was killed by the state because of his faith in Jesus. His younger brother John lived many, many more years than James, and he wrote some letters to the church, and we get to read some of his mail. And in 1 John 3, we read this portion of his letter. He says, we know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us. So we also ought to give up our lives for our brothers and sisters. If someone has enough money to live well and sees a brother or sister in need but shows no compassion, how can God's love be in that person? Dear children, let's not merely say that we love each other, let's show the truth by our actions. What has happened to John to talk about this love stuff? What's happened to the other disciples who were bigots and racists? They experienced in their hearts what John would later write those famous words, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. As if they would have said, for God so loved John, me. God so loved James. They understand that significant love that Jesus showed them on the cross in his resurrection. And God's love began to melt away the racism, the bigotry, the prejudices, the stereotypes, until John did not simply write, for God so loved the Jews. He wrote, for God so loved what?
The world.
The world. And that had to include the Samaritans. That had to include people of color. The cross tells us your life matters. No matter our color.
3 parts.
And that God's love brings hope by listening and by prayer and by action, by sharing Jesus. How is your heart today? How is your heart around people of different color or accents? How is your heart towards people that you maybe don't like and you have ill will towards? There's grudge and forgiveness, maybe in the family, maybe at work. How is your heart today? Jesus says, I've come to save you. I've come to save you from your stubbornness and your selfishness. Thanks be to God.